Espen work something out with the hammer. That could work, but you would need the Admiral's approval. Miakorva conceded. I'll make the appropriate arrangements. Espen blurted out. I'll read you need you down. With that matter settled, the group continued on with their tour in much the same way. Every few paces they would stop to comment on a particularly beautiful flower, a delicious-looking fruit, or the odd-looking vegetable. Many of the plants, even the more exotic ones, Mick kept for aesthetic purposes, were vaguely familiar to things the non-Earthlings had seen in the past. However, the eclectic collection was something to be marveled at. Varieties of apples, citrus, stone fruit, and so much more formed row after row, container after container. With a spectacle of Floritans recognized a few of plants his people had somehow brought with them when they were abducted. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, helped feed Tenz's people to this day, and he even saw a couple varieties in this that he was familiar with. The particularly pungent plant, the one with heavily trichomed flowers which were sticky to the touch, seemed to be something Mick was especially proud of. Samples of all of which were freely given after analysis from Nan verified their safety for the non-human biological being. When Tenz finally noticed one of the many fish tanks and ran to the edge, the experience was much the same as that of the strawberry. Fishing had always been one of Tenz's favorite pastimes as a child. He was resisting a strong urge to race back to his room, grab his rod and tackle, and spend the rest of the day trying out different tanks. Some of the fish in the tanks seemed similar to the ones on his home planet, but the strangely aggressive crustaceans hiding in some of the shallower areas were new. Mick had called them crawfish and claimed them to be delicious when boiled in a certain kind of broth. The degree of complexity in this artificial ecosystem was mind-boggling to Tenz, and for once he was genuinely proud of the people of Earth. To have these be the norm for nearly every station and colony designated for long-term habitation seemed like an extreme resource expenditure. Many larger vessels had some form of agricultural or productive areas, and the Hammer even had an industrial nutrition production facility. However, only the most prominent stations could boast about such a thoroughly well-created artificial ecosystem. As the tour of this section was finally coming to an end, everyone wanted to stay a little while longer. However, the last few reports still needed to be written and final arrangements for departure back to Earth made. The final stop would take them through Mick's workshop and engineering room, which only Nan was particularly curious to see. Though everyone knew Mick could talk at length about any number of highly technical subjects, only Nan had any real interest in the minutiae of technical engineering. While Mick was busy explaining a diagram being shown on a large monitor and whiteboard next to it, the rest wandered the space and took in strange sights. While Tenz was examining a pile of seemingly scrapped parts, curiously examining certain objects, the human and Quistar woman were wandering aimlessly through the area. Neither were particularly interested in these more technical or engineering-oriented things, one being a diplomatic office and the other a spy. The light conversation between the two was pleasant, but Miakorva could tell that Sarah was asking questions that only someone with specialty training would know to ask. Hold on. He keeps more than just sidearms on this scientific vessel. Miakorva cut Sarah off in the middle of her mocking Mick's obsession with firearms. I'm not kidding. The man has a serious problem, Sarah commented as she redirected the pair towards a row of cabinets at the side of the room. Hey, Mick, what's the passcode to your weapons locker? She shouted as they approached a particularly large, locked cabinet. Fuck you. The reply was shouted with equal volume from just outside of the view of the two women. Fuck you, too, Sarah shouted back with a hint of anger in her voice. No, that's the passcode. Mick's voice had a clear, mocking tone, but he seemed to be earnest about it. As Mia Corva watched Sarah roll her eyes and type in the code, the vulgar exchange left the quiztar slightly confused. Her translator had done its best to contextualize the phrase. However, that first word seemed to have so many and such diverse meanings that it was causing issues. That confusion, however, was quickly replaced with a warm feeling in her chest as the doors to the cabinet were opened and few items it contained nearly fell out. Even though her instincts wanted to react and try to stop the items from falling, even if it was obvious they had only slightly shifted, she was frozen from shock. See, I told you. Sarah broke the silence. The guy literally has a pile of guns. A no-joke pile of them. She was gesturing with her hands to really emphasize the absurdity of what was being presented. However, to Sarah's shock, Mia Corva's light purple freckles looked like they were starting to glow. How many does he have? Mia Corva finally asked after a long pause. God damn it, Sarah whispered to herself before turning her head towards Mick's direction. Mick, she likes you guns. The shout was followed by what sounded like a scramble as Mick nearly raced to the weapons locker. But there he saw the two women standing next to the admittedly shameful pile of assortments he had been building with spare resources and assembler time. Though he had been considering putting together an entire organization and rack system, he had gotten distracted by other projects. And now his procrastination had finally come back to haunt him as one woman looked at him disapprovingly and the other just stared at the pile. However, as he got closer, he began to notice the glowing freckles on Mia Corva's face, which vaguely reminded him of someone blushing. I really need to organize this mess, Mick admitted as he approached. I'm not the most organized person, but that is just bad. And probably unsafe. Sarah scoffed. Nah, I've got bolt locks in everything, and all the ammo is stored separate. They're only dangerous if you drop one on your foot. Mick tried to play it down, but he was aware of the potential hazards of this having many firearms without individually locking them down. Do you have a demonstration range on board? Mia Corva asked without even thinking about the relatively small size of this vessel. No, Mick said with a hint of confusion. Do you? The Gardens of Deathworlders, Part 6. And what exactly did he refer to these as? Akshika was trying her best to refrain from using pet names for tens in front of their guests, out of fear of embarrassing him. He used the word gun, which seems to be another fun part of his primary language. Tense replied without looking away from the wide assortment of weapons laid out on the table. It is a single word to describe a wide variety of projectile weapon systems which share a general function. I believe I heard another as well. And something about ignition? Akshika was just as enthralled by the diverse array of weapons as Tens was, though for a different reason. Where Tens was interested in the cultural and societal influences necessary to create such devices, Akshika was more interested in their capabilities and cost-effectiveness. There were a variety, like rifle, pistol, and machine gun. But I believe the word you're thinking of is firearm, Tense replied, with a somewhat distracted tone. He was looking at a particularly large weapon with what appeared to be an optical sight meant for incredibly long ranges, even beyond his mag sling. Yes, that one, Akshika confirmed. Though I do enjoy watching a campfire with you, she said in almost a whisper, as she leaned down slightly to close the distance between them. I'm not sure how I feel about fire-based weapons being demonstrated inside my ship. As Tenz thought about that for a moment, the implications dawned on him. Though none of these weapons looked like they actually use fire as their primary means of inflicting harm, Tenz couldn't be sure. His head shot up, and he tore his vision away from the arsenal to look for Mick. A few meters away, Tenz saw Mick, Sarah, and a few technicians from the demonstration range looking over a large display tablet and talking among themselves. Though he couldn't hear their conversation, Tenz felt a bit of relief as he saw Mick had a small rolled tobacco leaf burning in his mouth. If Mick was smoking in the room, then the atmospheric balance had a low enough oxygen percentage that a large ignition was unlikely. Though Tenz had noticed the smell early, it seemed far too sweet and light to be the Sema he was more familiar with. However, there were many other things about these humans he was unfamiliar with. Even though one could have been his cousin, and the other really wasn't all that different from women he knew back home, they were certainly unique. For example, they used chemical propellants as part of the mechanism for their most common form of weapons. I'm sure it'll be fine, Tenz finally said. Though Akshika didn't seem any less concerned, looks like he's almost got everything worked out with the technicians. Tenz looked at Akshika while motioning with his head in the direction of other humans. A sudden and loud clap quickly pulled both of their attentions towards the direction Tenz had just motioned in. As the two turned to look, they saw Mick and Sarah both standing and postured towards the diverse collection of commander staff and diplomatic officers. Though Sarah was facing ahead, Mick's head was turned off to the side as he reviewed one final item on the tablet being held towards him. As he turned towards the now attentive audience, Mick took one final drag off his rolled tobacco, knocked the smoldering end clean into a sealable ashtray, and placed the no longer burning roll behind his ear. Well, howdy everyone. In case you aren't aware, my name is Mikhail River, but y'all can me Mick. And he made a slight motion towards the red-haired woman, standing next to him at a respectful distance. My name is Sarah McAfee. Feel free to call me Sarah, she said, in an almost customer service tone of voice. Today, we get to give y'all a quick and dirty rundown on our most common personal weapon systems. Mick spoke with a relaxed authority that implied he was quite passionate about this topic. From what I understand, that's sort of the right way to make an introduction for some of y'all. I've got a wide variety on the table over there, and there will be booths where you can try them out after I'm done with this little presentation. Tenz, Akshika, and a variety of other beings of various forms were quietly and patiently listening to Mick explain some of the basic principles behind the chemistry and science of the weapons. Out of the corner of Tenz's perception, he felt someone approaching him. Before he could react, he felt a soft metal hand place a fairly bulky leather pouch being placed into his hand. As Tenz closed his grasp around the pouch, he felt the all-too-familiar form of his mag sling, in its compacted form. With a slight smile, he gently swung his elbow out and tapped against Nan's arm while quietly stowing the pouch into the satchel he wore. And before any of you ask, yes, we had developed new propellants and other non-explosive mechanisms for sending projectiles downrange. Though Tens had only been half listening to Mick speak, the idea of lighting off an explosive as a measure of launching a projectile did seem crude. But most of our small arms still use a nitrocellulose-based formula. Now, I could go on for hours about the science behind it all, but let's just skip to the fun part. Start small with my custom 4570. Mick pulled the large metal gun from his low hip holster, but was interrupted by an elbow and glare from Sarah. Die. Sarah coughed at Mick. Fine. I'm joking. We'll start with a baby. 22 pistol. Mick half laughed to himself as he holstered his personal sidearm and walked over to the table with all of the guns. Picking up a rather small one from one end, he walked back over to where he was standing and tried to hand the small weapon to Sarah. If you would do the honors. Ha! I'm an idiot. Sarah chided. It is way too funny seeing you hold that little thing. You do it. With a scoff, Mick took the couple steps to the wide open firing lane, situated below a few large display panels. Inserting a magazine into the weapon and holding it with the barrel facing towards a holographic target downrange, he half turned back to the group of observers. I'm using one magazine of fully lethal ammo for this part, so your systems can get proper data on it. Mick could sense some hesitation on the faces of his audience, so he wanted to help ease their concerns. However, the ammo I'll have available for y'all is less lethal, but can still do serious damage. Treat anything you see as if it will do the damage you see on those screens. Before I actually fire a single shot, my old firearms instructor would kill me if I didn't go over basic safety, even if y'all are active duty military. Mick continued on with the safety instructions and gave demonstrations using the relatively small weapon he had brought from the table. It was safe to say everyone in the room was well aware of concepts, such as keeping one's finger off the trigger until ready to fire and to treat every weapon as if it is always capable of killing. However, learning how to engage the safety, check the weapon's function, and render it inert after use were all critical information. Just as he seemed ready to actually get on with a live fire demonstration, he couldn't help but bring up one more critical piece of safety information. I know some of y'all's morphologies may make this slightly uncomfortable, but you all need to put in or activate your hearing protection. Almost everything here has some level of sound suppression, but they can still get loud. Mick paused for a moment to make sure everyone had their ear protection on or activated, and then turned to fire. The first shots that came from the small weapon in the large hand could be best described as quiet snaps. Even the individuals with more sensitive hearing had no issue whatsoever with this small example of a human firearm. After he emptied the magazine into the holographic target, the rounds all passing through and being caught by active shielding downrange, the displays above his head began showing the theoretical damage this small weapon would have caused, and quite a bit more information regarding it. Though it was certainly lethal, especially to some of the species who are not from Deathworlds, no one seemed particularly impressed so far. After Mick once again went over the procedures for making the weapon safe, he walked back to the table to exchange the small weapon for a slightly larger one. As he did with the first, he gave a brief demonstration and allowed to the system to gather the data it needed for its information and simulations. This firearm was just a step louder and impart